You can tell that that is a wonderful coffee, but it's not for you. It's got quite a lot of tanginess to it, and you would really like a little bit more roasted note, but you really love those beans. So with a Kaffelogic, you just go, oh, well, I'll just turn the dial up a little bit and run another batch through and see if I can get what I'm looking for out of these beans.
You must have it must be a pretty hardcore group of fans that thinks I can roast it better, different, or actually I just want to get into roasting versus what you get at the supermarket, right?
As a market, it's kind of layered, like the very hardcore enthusiasts who bought our product. Some of them even won't utilize the profiles that we give them. They immediately start creating their own. Some of them pull the machine apart and start fitting other bits to it. And so there's a small core like that. But then outside that core, there's just the really enthusiastic coffee drinker who wants to get control of their roast and take advantage of some of the special beans that they can get and maximise the freshness. And then there's further layers out of just really an ordinary coffee drinker who's discerning, wants good quality and wants convenience. And ultimately, that's the end game for us because that's the biggest market sector.
Okay, so for those who are listening in the audience now who are thinking, look, I love my coffee, I go down to the local store, there's a roastery there, they've got single origin, they keep control of their pressure or they keep control of how they do their roasting, although sometimes the coffee varies depending on the weather. What is it that the Kaffelogic machine does if that person had it in their house? What are the things that you get to control that are out of your control when you go to the cafe?
It's really everything to do with the roast. So if you can imagine that you've gone to a roastery and you've bought a really high quality Yirgacheffe, really lightly roasted, and you've brought it home, you've made an espresso, and you can tell that that is a wonderful coffee, but it's not for you. It's got quite a lot of food acid tanginess to it, and you would really like a little bit more roasted note, but you really love those beans, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So with a Kaffelogic, you just go, oh, well, I'll just turn the dial up a little bit and run another batch through and see if I can get what I'm looking for out of these beans. So it's a whole different ball game.
So it allows you to tinker a little bit more with the settings to get it to just the flavor profile that you want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And what's the raw ingredients? Like, what's the thing that you put into the machine? Is it simply the green bean, the green coffee bean?
It's the green coffee bean. Since the industrial age, coffee roasting has been taken over by commercial roasting. Prior to that, it was something you did in the home. You did roast coffee prior to making coffee. And because of that commercialization of roasting, most people don't really have much of an idea, and they haven't seen green coffee, and they don't really know how it comes about. Of course, it's grown on bushes in tropical parts of the world, and it's a red berry like a cherry when it's harvested. And from there, the outer hull is taken off and the centre of the cherry is dried out. And then after that processing, which has to take place on the farm, otherwise the coffee goes off and deteriorates, you can't actually ship it straight off the plant. So it's processed on the farm or at a nearby processing facility. And then from there, it has a storage life of 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, And so that in that form, it can be shipped around the world. Or when it lands in New Zealand in that form, that's basically when you want to get hold of it as fresh from the harvest as possible, as fresh from having landed in New Zealand as possible. So you're really getting the absolute maximum flavour out of the maximum freshness. And then you roast it, and then you can consume it when it's been freshly roasted. So you're sort of maximising all of those things. Yeah, and most people haven't seen that green bean because it's always purchased by a coffee roasting company. They roast it, bag it, and sell it to you.
So part of this is the control over the roasting process, but the second part you've just talked about there is you can get access to the beans at a freshness level that is more likely to provide a better quality coffee because it hasn't been sitting in a warehouse for 12 months. Or if it has, you know that because you're buying the original ingredient to go into your coffee. Is that right?
Well, yes, you can investigate that whole supply chain more. I mean, obviously a good coffee roaster isn't going to be using coffee that's been sitting around for 12 months. But at the same time, if they've got bags of it that have been sitting around for 12 months, they do have to use it up. So, you know, just as you'll be discerning in buying your roasted coffee, you can be discerning in buying your green coffee. And you can work your way back to trying to get it earlier in the process.
And where does one find these green beans? Like, is it in supermarkets or is it specialty coffee places? Is it online? Like, what are the different options for someone?
Yeah, it's not in supermarkets at this stage, but you will find it online. There's a number of people who specialise in green beans online, and a number of coffee roasters who will sell you roasted or grain on request. Okay. The other thing to do is just in New Zealand, it's really easy. You just walk into a coffee roaster and say, "Would you sell me some green beans?" And most of them will say, "Yeah, we will." So.
Now you've got in your machine, there's I think there's a dozen default roast profiles. What are some of the settings within that default roast profile? What are the things that you've had to consider when coming up with those profiles?
All right. Well, those profiles have been created by Wayne Burrows, who is a coffee specialist. And one of the factors that we've dealt with, and it's an area where we're actually groundbreaking on the world scene, and that is controlling through the roast process when that coffee will be at its best to drink. Huh. Now, most commercial roasters, when the coffee comes out of the roasting machine, it's not at its best. It takes at least 3 days before that coffee comes to its best flavour. And that's because there's an evolution of the ratios of the different flavour components over time. Now, Wayne has got into the roast process itself, and with the Kaffelogic, there's very fine control available during the roast process. And by altering the progress of temperature during the roast, he's altered the development of those chemicals to produce a coffee that's ready to drink straight out of the roaster.
Wow.
And this is, for a lot of roasters, they won't believe that. And one of the neat things that we get to do is have a bit of an experience showing them things. I was in Auckland last week and we went to Artigiano Brothers, and they were quite interested in the Kaffelogic, and we chatted to them for about half an hour. And then they said, "Oh, you know, you've got some coffee roasted in the Kaffelogic as a sample." And we said, "No, we haven't, but you've got green coffee here, grab some." So they went and grabbed a really nice specialty green coffee, and we threw it in the roaster and roasted it on a ready-to-drink profile. And it's always interesting seeing their faces. And then they made a coffee, and they tasted it, and yeah, that's actually drinkable. Because they're expecting that it won't be drinkable. It'll have all sorts of defects. It needs its 3 days. So the surprise that comes over their face when they go, oh, that's actually really drinkable. I like that. That's good. It's quite interesting to see
Well, that's
the
great.
gears spinning inside the experienced roaster's mind when we do that.
It certainly is when you get to see the reaction, and from someone that's a qualified mind too, as you'd expect a coffee roaster to be.
Yes.
How easy is it for someone that isn't a coffee roaster to start getting into this, to understand how to do it and to start changing the settings?
Yeah, well, that's where the 12 profiles that you mentioned come in. Most users, that's all they'll ever need, really. Now, those 12 profiles are broken out. Some of them are ready to drink. Some of them, the coffee needs resting for 3 days to reach its peak flavour.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got that choice. In fact, it's quite good if you're roasting on the weekend for the week, then you can roast some ready to drink and some on the 3-day resting, so that when the ready to drink runs out about Wednesday, the other stuff is just ready to go. So you get to choose between those two, but also the different growth altitudes of the world where coffee is grown affect the density and behaviour of the coffee bean. And so it's as simple as working out where your coffee was grown and then picking an appropriate profile which is optimised to that altitude.
So if the coffee is grown, let's say in Ethiopia, I don't know what the altitude would be there, but does it get denser the higher up you go or the lower down?
Yes, it does. Because there's less oxygen and colder temperatures, the coffee grows slower and denser. And so you tend to get more intense flavour and a denser bean, and you're going to roast it in a different way. So you'd look on our map and you'd see that Ethiopia is typically 1,500 to 2,000 metres for most of their coffee. So you pick that profile. And then you adjust the finishing point on the profile according to your own tastes and how you're going to brew it. So there's a level system where you can just put in the number that takes it down into the lighter roast or up into the darker roast off that same profile. So basically that's what the user's doing. They're picking the right profile for the beans, and then they're experimenting with the different levels to match up to what their tastes are after.
This sounds like such an amazing machine for the coffee geeks out there, because coffee is something that many people geek out to. It's a very personal preference
Absolutely.
thing, and you're giving them control over the part before actually making the coffee. What's it been like to get the word out about Kaffelogic and throughout New Zealand, or is there customers overseas as well?
Yes, we at the moment we'll be selling as much or more in Australia than we are in New Zealand, and we have got trial customers in over 20 countries.
Wow.
So we have got quite a global presence. Because those coffee geeks, as you say, are really quite enthusiastic, they tend to be on online forums and following the latest trends in coffee quite avidly. So there's a current of sharing information which has gone out quite quickly about the Kaffelogic to the world. For us, the big challenge is to get through to the more mainstream market who aren't following those forums actively. And that will be a challenge for us, because those are people who aren't usually aware that you even can roast coffee or even know what a green bean is. So we've got quite a lot to communicate to those people.
And it's a different type of market too. It may be those that love great quality products, whether it's food or beverage, but also value convenience. So if this is just as convenient and provides them the quality flavor profiles, it's an easier switch. If there's more technical sides to it that maybe someone who's super technical and passionate engineering about it loves, but maybe that's not the mainstream part. I'm sure you've got a lot of these machines in Wellington, being the coffee capital of New Zealand. Have you? Is it something that you can have in a business setting as well?
You can, and we do have some businesses who do have it. You have to be a little bit careful about smoke alarms in a commercial building. If you set off a smoke alarm at home, you just press the hush button usually, and that's the end of it. But in a commercial building, the consequences can be building evacuation. So we're just a little bit more cautious about people putting them in. You have to manage the ventilation properly.
Okay, so this is for the home user. It's for the coffee geek now. The ultimate market is to get into the consumerization of green bean roasting to give you more control at home.
Yes.
Now, you've been part of NZ Made since, I think it was early 2018, going back on the records, Chris. What made you decide to actually make one of these machines? Because it's a big deal, right? Like to manufacture something from scratch takes a lot of effort.
It has taken a lot of effort. And initially, it was a hobby project for me. But what happened with that hobby project was that people were saying to me, actually, this is really good. We want one. And so I thought, well, what would it take to commercialise that product? Of course, if I'd known how much effort it would be, I wouldn't have done it. But I went down that journey, and it has been a great journey, and it's put me in touch with some wonderful people, a wonderful industry, and it's been very rewarding. But yes, certainly very, very hard work to overcome all the issues in getting a product to market. An electrical cooking appliance to market is quite a lot of hoops to jump through.
What were a couple of the maybe one high moment and one low moment on that roller coaster journey of bringing something to life, not just as a prototype, but across into commercialization? Well,
I think for me, the really exciting thing about bringing it to life was being within the Dunedin sort of engineering ecosystem, that I could go to a provider like JTech Plastics in Mosgiel with a sketch on the back of an envelope, and Jason can sit me down and go, look, that isn't going to work, and flip the envelope over and do his own sketch on the back and say, this might work, and send me off. And being able to go through that process without having to front up with any money was for me a great highlight, because I just love collaborative design. And here I was actually doing collaborative design with the manufacturers in Dunedin up front. So that was certainly a great thing.
It's great the way you've got that network, because it's very hard to innovate on your own. There's always a network group of people, certainly, to bring something this complex to life.
Yes.
And it's
now, yeah. A low point has been when we're trying to get electrical compliance certification, and at the very last minute, they come back with some little thing like, we're going to need a fuse in this circuit. After we've done all the circuit design and actually got the prototypes made and everything, we have to retrofit a component to meet the requirements of the standard. And yeah, so then there's all the time in working out the appropriate component, getting it sorted as a manufacturing process, and then going back to the test authorities to have it all retested.
it's those things usually right at the end of the process where you've solved the problem, but not necessarily within the compliance or regulatory landscape.
Correct.
I know, food and beverage, craft beer providers that they've got everything installed, and then MPI comes to visit, and rightly so, has to make sure that certain things are done in a certain way, and that doesn't always align with solving the problem, because their job is to solve a different set of problems. It's not functionality, it's safety.
Yep. No, that's right. And of course you kick yourself for not having allowed for that when you went into it, but there's always things like that.
And even if you did allow for it and you knew all those rules, they could actually constrain your thinking around solving the actual problem. So it's a juggling act.
I think that's true. And the other thing it tends to do is you tend to over-engineer. So you might choose a more expensive component or a more expensive, complicated way of going about something because you're aware of all of those rules. And you'd never actually discover that the really simple solution might actually work and comply.
That's exactly it. And your product, Kaffelogic, isn't just hardware either. With the electronics, you've had to build software over the top of it, and was one of the first businesses, at least I've seen on your website, to add the New Zealand code logo on there. Talk me through the software side of it. Like how did you get that running?
There's layers to the software. The first and most important is the firmware that runs the actual appliance.
These are the things on the chips themselves.
Yes. So the actual appliance itself is quite a simple piece of engineering, comparatively simple piece of engineering. There's a minimum number of moving parts. It makes it very reliable. And it's the firmware that actually gives it the quality. It's the firmware that's actually producing that something special in the coffee comes from the firmware. So I've always described the machine itself as the minimum hardware required to run the firmware. So that's the first thing. We've got quite a number of innovations in the roast control system that we use. I really reinvented the roast control system from scratch, and the results speak for themselves. They're very good. Then on top of that, we have a software product which allows you to edit your roast profiles and communicate with the roaster. And we make that available freely. That's just really a piece of open source free software that it isn't a lot of use to you if you don't have one of our roasters, but it's freely available. And it's there are quite a lot of commercial users who've got their other software products and they look at ours quite jealously because they find it a lot easier to use.
Who did the coding of the firmware for the hardware side of it and the software for the end consumer to use to dial up their own roast profiles?
I actually did that.
No way.
I came to this project primarily as a software developer.
Very multi-talented there, Chris. So you've come with as a software developer, because that makes sense now, because a lot of software developers drink a lot of coffee.
Yeah, exactly. Mm.
So you could see what needed to be done here. So that's the eye of detail of turning good beans into great beans through code. Where are you at now? Like, it's now kind of mid-November. We're coming up to the Christmas season. It's New Zealand May Day next week. What should someone be doing if they're listening to this podcast and thinking maybe this would make a great gift? Where are the types of places they can go to purchase their own coffee roaster?
Well, we've got a list of retailers on our website, and we've got quite a number of retailers in New Zealand and Australia. So if you want to see one in action, then it's a good idea to make contact with one of those retailers because they've all got stock. In New Zealand, you can buy them directly from our website as well.
Anything else to add, Chris, either about the machine, the software, the Kaffelogic community that has been part of your journey to date? Anything that maybe I haven't asked you about that I should have?
Well, I think for me, coming as a software developer into the coffee industry, it's been a really nice industry to come into. There's some really great characters in the coffee industry. And I've been very fortunate to gather a really great team around me. So that's been a great experience. We're really proud to be a New Zealand company and to be able to make, manufacturing a home appliance in New Zealand is something that we're proud of being able to do.
Well, I think you deserve all the credit because it's not an easy thing to create a home appliance in New Zealand, and it's not something that is that common anymore. It was probably more common in the 80s and 90s. So I think what you've managed to do is find a niche where people go absolutely crazy for the end product, which is great coffee, and your product speaks to an even better way of doing coffee because it gives control to that individual. So the best coffee isn't necessarily one particular flavor or style, and if you can allow that individual to control their own flavor and style profile at the roasting stage, you're actually most of the way there.
That's right. We had a conversation with a customer just the other week who was saying that he'd started to lose interest in coffee, and now he's got a Kaffelogic. All his passion for coffee had been rekindled, and he was really enjoying it.
I love that because it's a whole nother level to tinker into for those coffee geeks. But as you said, I think this is a really interesting alternative or addition to put on the kitchen top next to that fancy coffee machine that you're showing off to your friends. There's kind of an equivalent to this, I think, in craft beer with Williams Warren, where you can brew your own beer at home. For the type of person that wants to do that, but is interested in coffee, yours is the machine to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing about craft brewery is that most people who brew their own beer are still happily buying commercially brewed beer as well. But once you've become accustomed to the coffee that you roast yourself, you're very reluctant to go out and try anywhere else because it just doesn't live up to your expectations anymore.
I would love to have some of the beans that are roasted through your machine to feel that conversion. I know when I came back from London in the early 2010s, I was fortunate enough to get a coffee made for me by the barista champion from Flight Coffee, Nick, and that was at the time was at their roastery in Onikawa in Hawke's Bay, and they had full control of the roast and the machine, and just to taste something, and maybe it's because I had a pretty bad palate from coffee in London because it was kind of pre the coffee scene, but that was just such an amazing coffee. I can still remember it to this day. So that there's levels to it, and I think what you've managed to do with this machine is, for those that really love it, they can take it that next level.
Yes, that's right. And that coffee is amazing, and that when you have that kind of experience, you do remember it, as you say. Yeah. So our ideal is that everyone can be able to create that memorable coffee every day.
And it's a routine thing, I like at the moment, my routine is I will grind the beans myself. I'll make a coffee. It used to be for a while, it was a stovetop, but I like that whole routine of, making something with my hands. A lot of, the rest of my time is digital like this or meeting. It's not physically making something, but I enjoy doing that with the coffee at the start of each day.
Yeah. And so adding a coffee roaster is a logical thing to do.
I'm talking myself into it as a Christmas present here, Chris. Hey, look, thank you very much for your time today, and I appreciate you sharing both with the NZ Made and NZ Code community, and of course those Kaffelogic roaster owners who have a machine already will probably end up listening to this through the notice boards that you run on the kaffelogic.com site. Yeah. So I really appreciate your time today.